Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kshitij Kapoor. I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of King's College London, and it is a privilege for me to welcome you to this lunchtime, almost lunchtime, seminar today. And this is on the issue of TRAC. It's one of those standard rituals that British universities go through every year. And then they look away because it's put in the too hard basket. And then we return every other year and looks even a little bit worse. And then we again fill it out, give it in, look away. But I think we can't avoid it forever. And that's why we thought we should speak about it. We should make it more transparent to those who don't spend all their time looking at university finances as to what it tells us. And that's the purpose of today. But then there's plenty of time for your questions. And we're delighted that close to 200 plus colleagues will be joining us, and your questions will be very welcome to make this a live session. Now, the only thing I would say is the title says broke or broken. I might elaborate the title a bit. I would say UK universities are great, they are broke, and the model is broken. So we should not forget, we don't want to get into a doom loop, that we have one of the world's finest university systems. In terms of graduation rates, we have one of the highest graduation rates. In terms of research productivity, we have one of the best research productivities of any university system that there is. But what the TRAC data will tell you, that these universities are running on what one could say a statutory deficit. So we still pay our bills, but in terms of maintaining ourselves so that we are fit for tomorrow, that we can invest in our real estate, our IT, etc., we're unable to do it. But the more important thing isn't our financial situation today, is that the way it is being managed is through significant cross subsidies. And that's what you'll learn about. And those cross subsidies are now becoming so precarious that one has to worry, when will this sort of merry-go-round stop? And that is the point of today's panel. And then, of course, your questions and answers. And we'll start off with Richard Salter, who will tell you about the facts. Richard, Director of Analytics here at King's. Over to you.
In terms of what the TRAC is telling us at a headline level, the graph shows the cost recovery for the sector as a whole from the most recent return, which is 2023-24, and how much of a surplus or deficit the sector makes across those different activities. And any stakeholder in the sector will see that it's not a particularly pretty picture at the moment. For institutions in England and Northern Ireland, the overall deficit for the year was £2 billion, which was a slight improvement compared to the previous year, but was pretty comparable to 21-22. So it's not an ephemeral outcome in that sense. From the graph, it's clear there's only one major activity which is generating a margin, which is non-publicly funded teaching. The sector has been enjoying rising overseas numbers year on year, but in 23-24, the sector saw the first decrease in the number of overseas students for the first time in more than a decade. That rate of decline actually increased in 24-25, even fewer students. We're going to have to wait to see what the 25-26 student enrollment data looks like, but a lot of forecasts are saying that they're expecting it to drop yet again. So when the only profitable activity is in decline and the need to subsidize other activities is hardwired into the system, it obviously raises some pretty fundamental concerns around financial sustainability and how that can be assured. It's a good question. It's one I wish I had a good answer to. In reality, it's unlikely to be a singular answer. And the means through which financial sustainability will be assured is going to differ between the different parts of the sector. The basic premise of the report is that there is a role for TRAC play in helping stakeholders work out what that answer to financial sustainability is. One of the areas which is currently in deficit is publicly funded teaching. With the introduction of the 9,000 fee back in 2012, it was initially generating a small margin, but as inflation progressively eroded the value of that fee in real terms, it went to break even, and for the last sort of 7 years has now been in deficit. The recent increases in the UG home regulated fee may help arrest that rate of decline, but in and of themselves, they're unlikely to end the trend altogether. with other factors such as below rate of inflation increases in the teaching grant and other expenditure pressures on providers, such as the relatively recent increase in employers' national insurance. The headline figures do mask a huge amount of variation in cost recovery, both between providers and within each one of those activity groups. So publicly funded teaching is a good example. Institutions receive a relatively small amount of additional funding for high cost subjects that don't really get close to reflecting the higher levels of expenditure it takes to actually deliver those courses. Research, as you'll see from the graph, is by far the most significant deficit, amounting to £5.4 billion in 23-24. This equated to a cost recovery rate of 66%, which is actually the lowest level of cost recovery since the TRAC methodology was introduced. I think you have to go all the way back to 2010 to see the record cost recovery level. So it has been reducing quite significantly over time. In terms of some of the variations we see within the sector, we receive benchmarking data on TRAC returns, both for our peer group and the other peer groups and the sector as a whole. The graph shows the lower and upper quartile and the median across those four broad activity groups. And you can see even at that level, there's some quite wide ranges in the cost recovery that people are being able to achieve, even in areas where the income is relatively standardized. So looking at publicly funded teaching, where the cap is the level that the vast majority of providers sort of charge at. The teaching grant from OFS is standardized, but we're still seeing some very different levels of cost recovery within those areas. Sometimes small percentages may not reflect just how pronounced an impact this can have on an institution's financial sustainability. If you're looking at a research-intensive university, a large research-intensive university, the difference between getting a 70% cost recovery on research versus a 60% could be as much as £50 million. Likewise, for those institutions which are teaching intensive, the difference between being at the median, sort of 91%, or being at the upper quartile, 97%, is going to be very significant on an institution's financial health. TRAC has a role, potentially there's more scope to grow that role in promoting the efficiency that exists within the sector by identifying and promulgating best practice. Having a better sense of what the drivers are behind these very different levels of cost recovery, whether that be regional, where you're based, the type of provider you are, the delivery methods that you're using, would be really advantageous in helping inform stakeholders' efforts to ensure financial stability. To look at in a bit more detail. So this is the research broken out by the sponsor type. QR sits separate to this, so it's not factored into the individual columns, but is factored into the overall activity cost recovery rate of 66%. As you can see, all of them are failing to cover their costs. Some that's by a relatively small margin, others much more significant. The fact that research requires runs at a direct financial loss is nothing new and not particularly surprising. Indeed, it's hardwired into the system. UK RI fund at 80% of FEC, with institutions agreeing to provide the balance from other sources. It's not necessarily the cost recovery they intend. So Research Council's UK RI, it's intended to be 80%, but actually is consistently below that rate, achieving 68.1% in the most recent return. There's been some recent UK RI funded studies looking at the various reasons why this might be, and that gets unpacked in the report in a bit more sort of detail. Charity is one of the areas with the lowest research cost recovery rate. Part of that is that there is support within the kind of QR funding stream, the Charity Support Fund, but this has been increasing only relatively marginally over the last 15 years, going up by just 13%. So for those institutions whereby the nature of their academic footprint is such that charities are the main funder in that area, that's creating some real challenges. Again, PGR students may not be particularly well served by some of the TRAC methodology. It doesn't take into account the RDP, the Research Degree Programme supervision funding that comes in through QR. And it also doesn't reflect the contribution that PGR students make to many other activities, indeed, including teaching. So if research runs at such a loss and institutions are concerned about their financial sustainability, why don't they just do less research? Well, quite apart from that not necessarily being in alignment with their goals and mission, there is some interlinkage between how the model is currently working. Some would claim that's proof that this cross-subsidy is working. The graph shows the correlation in institutions' overall rank in the two major global league tables and the non-regulated PGT international fees that they provide. And there's a very strong correlation between those two things. The coefficient comes out at 0.84. And indeed, if you were to focus on this section graph, those people ranked in the top 200, the correlation is even stronger. The main metrics in those league tables are reputational surveys and metrics relating towards research. So an institution's research profile can be seen to be driving its reputation, which in turn is what enables it to command kind of higher fees and therefore generate the margin on that non-publicly funded teaching that can provide that cross-subsidy. Whilst that may make a degree of sense, it doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable. And obviously with the decline in overseas students, even the degree to which the current system is working is open to question. There's actually a recent study done, which because we are now increasingly competitive for a declining market in terms of size, that actually 1/4 of all PGT international students in the UK are actually net bringing in less funding than their home equivalencies because of the expenditure on agents, marketing, fee waivers, discounts, and other investments that institutions are having to make in order to try and shore up their market share and the size of their overseas cohort. The report does go on to make some recommendations, which I won't unpack here because I'm conscious of time and we want to leave as much time as possible for questions at the end. So I'll stop sharing at that point and hand back to Kshitij.
Thank you, Richard. That's a wonderful introduction. For those who already know TRAC, this would have just rehearsed. And for those who didn't, hopefully it gave you a good sense of TRAC. And the document itself has been posted in the chat, should you wish to keep it for further reference. Now, next is Professor Jackie Labby. Jackie has been leading the TRAC effort for many years from her role at the University of Gloucestershire. She's now at Central St. Martin's, but these challenges are everywhere. So over to you, Jackie, as to your perspectives as a leading academic and someone who's leading universities.
Thank you very much for that, Kshitij. So I thought I'd talk to you just a little bit about the TRAC Development Group, which is the group that I've chaired for the last several years. And it is responsible really for overseeing the development of TRAC, as it says in its name, in a variety of different ways, and just sort of unpack a little bit about how it kind of manages that. So the TRAC Development Group, it meets 3 to 4 times per year. Its membership is pretty wide-ranging: senior academics, the PVC, DVC level, senior finance colleagues, those with planning remits, experienced practitioners being those colleagues within universities who have responsibility for actually filling out the TRAC return, and also representatives from ARMA, AHUA, HESPA, the Research and Funders Group, so Office for Students, UKRI, Scottish Funding Council, and MEDDER. So it's quite a wide-ranging membership. And over the course of any one year, there are 3 main BAU things that TDG oversees. So it does oversee the work of the support unit. This is KPMG currently, who are there to answer questions for those who need to fill out the TRAC return, run focus groups, run other forms of support activities. We oversee the annual review of TRAC guidance. So those who are very au fait with this know that every year there's some little bit of change, bit of updating, bit of clarification. We oversee that. And we are involved in the annual planning of the TRAC Practitioners Conference, which Kshitij very kindly came and gave us our keynote this past September. Then there are kind of one-offs that we oversee. So we will pick up projects that are assigned to us by researchers and funders groups. So for instance, a recent MSI review. MSI is kind of like Marmite. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's very much an integral part of TRAC. There will be projects that we propose. So you will have noticed in the report, it makes reference to the fact that we used to have TRAC-T. We don't have it anymore. TDG is very much minded to try to develop a replacement for TRAC-T, so not simply bringing it back on in its previous form, but giving us some new form of TRAC-T to help us understand these actual specific costs of teaching. They can respond to requests from the sector. So for instance, again, thinking about a review of the peer groups, the university peer groups have been in place for a very long time. Over the course of that time, many universities have changed their missions and their activities. There is a lot of, I think, desire to see those reviewed. And supporting other work. So for instance, the DFE has recently been running a project around the cost of teaching, and TDG has attempted to help with that. Now, the TRAC return is itself a kind of up and down flow of information. So it does draw information about costs from audited statements. MSI, again, swoops in from the side. But there's something very particular, I think, about TRAC that is important to keep in mind, which is that the institutional data that informs the TRAC return originates from one of three different ways of collecting that. So first of all, the time allocation survey that many universities run, academics fill this out in a variety of different ways, as are described in the report. There is workload allocation model formats, and then there's a statistical model that's not used by very many institutions. For me, as chair of TDG and as an academic who has in the past filled out the TAS, there are real limitations, I think, in the way that TRAC itself collects this kind of data. Anybody who has done the TAS knows that it's hard to understand. It can be difficult for an academic to understand the difference between publicly funded teaching, non-publicly funded teaching, for instance. As a return, it often gets used for different purposes. So there may be a sense that an academic might fill it out to show how overworked they are. And as somebody who used to run a faculty, I remember having to talk with colleagues about, this is not the point of the TAS. If you want to talk about your overwork, you use different methods, but you don't try to show through your TAS that you're working a 70-hour week, for instance. The workload allocation model, putatively, might look like it is more objective, but there's more than one model out there. And the very fact that there are so many different kinds of models, again, I think can kind of make the data a little less reliable. So the data is being gathered in contrasting ways, and I think, again, with less than an optimal staff understanding or buy-in about what it actually is achieving on the other side, which I think gives us opportunities for further complexity in trying to understand what TRAC is telling us. And really crucially, I think there is quite a limited understanding that TRAC returns feed directly into the costing of research. So when academics and others are filling out their TRAC return or their TRAC survey, that connection is something that I think is invisible to a lot of people. Something that I think Kshitij has mentioned and is in the report, there is also a real institutional resistance to learning from TRAC. So I think a lot of institutions see it as a burden, a regulatory tick box, get it out there, forget about it. Ineffective oversight groups, for instance, a VC or CFO lack of enthusiasm. And in the absence of that, I think it's very hard for an institution to then find ways to make productive use of its own TRAC data. A couple of years ago, I did lead a TDG project on trying to work with the sector on finding interesting and creative ways to make use of its TRAC data. Found very hard to get traction from universities on that, even though other groups were interested in it. So there is definitely interest within TDG in working with the sector to find ways for institutions to engage with their own data. In trying to help with this, we recently updated the guidance for governing bodies and executive teams to try to understand what is TRAC, why is it used, what can it be used for, how does it inform the rest of kind of government and Office for Students activities and oversight. And we recently also produced some new guidance for academics that's customizable for institutions to help academics understand what it's all about as well. TDG can work with research and funders group to propose projects that can help the sector to make better use of TRAC, though it must also follow the RFG steer on that as well. So there's some limits in what we can actually do to make TRAC a little bit more interesting for the sector. But I think, and this is really just to pull it together and something that I think would be really interesting, hopefully, to talk about in terms of Q&A, the biggest single opportunity in terms of making a much better use of TRAC is for VCs and CFOs to recognize the value that TRAC does add in understanding their institution's costs, to interrogate it when it looks odd. Just as an example, some years ago at a previous institution, the TRAC data showed that it actually cost more to teach history than it cost to teach physics in the institution I was working in. Now, that's an odd kind of outcome. Luckily, in that institution, there was interest in trying to unpack that and figure out what it meant. So that was a great opportunity to say, this isn't just data, this is telling us something. This is telling us something we need to understand. And again, helping VCs and CFOs to ensure that their executive teams and their governing bodies, which is also really crucial, see TRAC as adding to the sum of knowledge about their institution and the sector as a whole. For me as an academic, I think TRAC is really, really interesting. We can do a lot more with it. As a sector, I think we need to come together and work on what that might look like. Thank you.
Jackie, first of all, thank you to you and the TRAC Development Group and all the colleagues across the universities who make it real. I think through Richard and Jackie's presentation, you have a sense of how diligently it is done, how much good information it has in there. But over to you now for short comments, Alison and then Nick. If it is so useful, if it is telling us something so deeply fundamental about our system, if it is about money and we're in trouble with money, why don't universities and governments make more use of it? So Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kshitij. Well, I remember when TRAC started, and I'll come back to that at the very end. And I'd also like to start with a very quick anecdote about being part of the Auger review of post-18 education and funding. And when we started that review, a number of enthusiastic people in number 10 said, you'll be able to use all these TRAC data, and KPMG have been analysing uphill and downhill, and you're going to be able to say all sorts of things about how universities could be more efficient or where the money is being wasted. And those of us who worked in universities were skeptical. And I have to say, if you plough your way through the Auger review, you will see that regrettably, there's not much that we were able to take from TRAC. Now, I think there are two reasons for this. The first goes back to the origins of TRAC, which were very much to do with research funding. And I would say that on that front, it actually is doing some very useful things. But what it is confirming is, as Richard said, that we have built into the model some necessary and possibly some unnecessary practices of cross-subsidy, and those are becoming unmanageable. And I think that broad picture is one which we get from TRAC. It's very valuable and it needs to be underlined. But I also think that because it is essentially, to me, an approach that bears the marks of its origins in being constant in the concern about research funding costs, what it doesn't do is pick up on a huge amount of what is going on in universities today. And actually, when you look at the form that we all fill in, it sort of speaks to a slightly forgotten world of, when universities were basically quite quiet places with lots of academics in departments and a little bit of departmental support. And this is not today's university world. I mean, even in the years that I have been at King's, for example, when I first came to King's to join the management department, we had 2 full-time staff. Now, we were a load smaller. But if you look at a modern faculty, certainly in a research university, we have a huge number of professional services staff doing a large number of things which in a modern, large university are absolutely fundamental. Now, we can talk about whether these are necessary or not, but the reality is that half of the staff in our universities are professional services. And it's a bit weird to have a model which, when it's thinking about costs, is so focused on, okay, the things that students see, the research, the teaching, that's why we're there at some level. But it's really odd to be not taking note of things which have become so fundamental. We have marketing. We have huge regulatory obligations. We are in an arms race on facilities as part of the way we attract students. We are marketing third stream activities. All of these things are fundamental to our income and to our cost pressures. And one of the things that came out for me very clearly, which Richard and Alil also highlight, is that a large part of what is going on in TRAC is really quite invisible. And for example, Richard says very clearly that, very diplomatically, there is scope for variability in how it is completed, in particularly in how the drivers that we use to assign the costs of all the things that sit underneath academics, research, and teaching activities. So it seems to me that until we actually tackle this, we're not going to get anywhere near a meaningful view of whether or not we're really achieving full economic cost or not, and where we might actually make changes. And I think that, to me, is really fundamental. The other thing that I'd just like to note, because I think we sometimes lose sight of it because of TRAC, is that when politicians, which they frequently do, say, you know, so why do universities cost so much more than schools? And we tend to go, oh, well, we're big and we have libraries and we do research which isn't fully funded. We also do scholarship. That's part of our role. And if we aren't going to make that clearer and defend it, then I think we really risk it being seen as something which is marginal and not necessary. And I don't think TRAC does us a favor in just calling this own research, because it's not just the subsidizing of outward facing research, it is this scholarship function. So finally, I'd like to go back to sort of my very early experience with TRAC, which was when it was first being piloted. And I actually happened to be in one of the institutions which was doing it. And we started by keeping very, very detailed diaries, which was a lot of work, a sample of assistance. And that was actually really fascinating. Now, obviously, once you go national, you have simple forms. But it underlined again the point that I think that Richard and Alil make very powerfully, that if you're actually going to use this to do really detailed analysis of costs, you need something much more granular. And it's a bit like the cliche about, you know, you won't get the job right if you don't have the right tool. I think we have to be clearer about what national level TRAC can do. I personally would make it much more about research and not promise that it can do more about other things. I think we also need to do a lot more on collecting granular information and sharing that across the sector on a lot of our other costs.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I'll turn to Nick in a second, but I would also alert colleagues that the number of questions that have come in, and actually, if you can just screen those questions and upvote the questions, because in the end, we'll have limited time. And I want to make sure the things that are most interest to you get addressed. But Nick, over to you. You've observed TRAC for many years now. Every year it's published. There is always that one editorial that bemoans the underfunding of research and, you know, the increasing deficit. And then not much else happens. So tell us why, and tell us if it's going to change.
Well, thank you, Kshitij, and you're right. We are happy the Higher Education Policy Institute, like the KPI, the King's College Policy Institute, have produced reports on TRAC. I've got one here in my hand. We did it in 2017. It was written by a fabulous intern we had. And I wanted to start with an anecdote about it, a little bit the same way as Alison started with an anecdote, because we launched this report at an event at the London School of Economics. We had a very eminent professor, and who happened also to be a member of the House of Lords, chairing our event. And rather than chairing it impartially to discuss what this report showed, which was, of course, a very significant cross-subsidy from international students to research, he laid into the author and said it was irresponsible of her and irresponsible of us to publish these numbers, because back then, and this is going back nearly a decade, there was still a view that was quite common in the sector that cross subsidies within universities was something the universities should worry about, but nobody outside should worry about, and that it was wrong to open the bonnet and shine a light on it. But the funny thing about this report was the person who put us up to doing it was the research director of the London School of Economics itself, because he had come to us and said, I'm getting very frustrated that the people who work in my institution don't understand how underfunded research is and the scale of the cross subsidies, and we want someone to shine a spotlight on it. So there were arguments going on within that institution, and we think it was an important report. And in fact, we updated it a few years later. But another reason why I think your report is so timely and why I think we should be talking about these issues is that one very big thing has changed in recent years. Because in the old days, we had one minister, one department, one regulator and funder for teaching and research in universities. And so maybe there was more of a case for not distinguishing between the two as much. These days, we have two ministers, two departments, two funders and regulators. And I think, therefore, it's just inevitable, whether we like it or not, that we need to think about teaching and research and the cross subsidies between them to a greater degree than perhaps we did in the past, and indeed back in the days when the TRAC was first mooted. In that report in 2017, we showed the level of the cross subsidy from non-publicly funded teaching. Let's just focus on research. We found that the full the economic costing, the cost recovery, let's say, of research was running at 73%. When we reran it 3 years later, we found the cost recovery was 69%. Your report out today shows it's running at 66%. So we've been losing close to 1 percentage point of cost recovery a year on research in a period when policymakers of all colours have been telling us that R&D is the future of the UK and exalting the power of publicly funded R&D to crowd in private money. And I think that's interesting. And of course, one way in which the TRAC data has now recently been used in a way that perhaps it wouldn't have been used in the past is in both Universities UK's blueprint, which you were very involved with, Kshitij, and also the higher education, the post-16 education and skills white paper that came out a fortnight or so ago. And I think it's important that we think about what the white paper says for a moment or two, because it's a slightly odd document. You can see very clearly the joins between the three secretaries of state that own that document: education, work and pensions, and science, innovation and technology. But when it comes to the agenda we've got to today, it specifically says we need to improve cost recovery for research. And it simultaneously, of course, reminds us that we're about to be hit by a 6% levy on international student fees. So there'll be less money to do the cross subsidy. And also the government wants to move closer to full cost recovery. So the end result, as the white paper itself says, is we will work, it's the government, we will work with the sector and other funders to address the cost recovery of research. We recognise this may result in funding a lower volume of research, but at a more sustainable level. And I don't think that is the firm government commitment in the white paper. And it feels to me like we haven't yet fully discussed as a sector what that means for the research pipeline, what it means for the research base on a regional basis, and indeed what it means for perhaps discoveries that will not happen because the volume of research is less. I suspect it's what you get inevitably if you have what we have, which is we've given the Minister for Science an additional responsibility to be the champion for the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. And that does lead you towards a greater concentration. Now, I've assumed that the TRAC numbers are accurate, and Jackie talked us through some of the challenges in getting accurate TRAC numbers. But I don't think we should underestimate some of the skepticism within universities and among academics when they collect that data. I contacted one very deep thinking academic and economist actually at a university yesterday to ask him what he thought about TRAC, because I knew he had strong numbers. And he said he regarded it as a piece of fiction to conceal how much teaching subsidizes research. And the specific example he gave were colleagues who were on a contract that was 40% teaching, 40% research and 20% admin, who actually spent a lot more than that on research, but didn't gain the system when they filled in their forms. And a second academic I contacted yesterday said, I think it's a classic case of looking for a lost wedding ring under the lamppost, even when you've lost it a mile away. Universities obviously have an incentive to say that teaching UK students and doing research is more expensive because they hope to get more public funding from the government for it. That is why TRAC does not lead to better business models. The stuff is known to be suspect. Now, we may think that's a bit strong, and Jackie may be able to tell us why it's a bit strong, but I don't think we should underestimate the level of skepticism among many people filling in these forms. And I think it explains a question Richard put as a conundrum at the beginning, which is, why don't universities respond to their own data? I've only ever found one university, which was Dundee, that said, and it only did it very temporarily, we're not going to do any major new pieces of research because we lose money on research in the TRAC data. So just to conclude, I think with 3 points really, I think we do need the TRAC, but we need to recognize the process and results are not always trusted by those that complete the data. I think we because institutions don't always respond to the data themselves, I think we're sometimes guilty of looking like we're crying wolf when we talk about the data. And thirdly, I think we need to recognize that this data is not the slam dunk, even if it were perfect, that we might like it to be, because every sector that's pitching for government money produces data that explains why they need to be better funded. And we're always in a battle with that. And just to end with another tiny anecdote, when I was special advisor to the Minister for Universities and Science, and we were pitching to the Treasury to increase the cost recovery, to move towards full economic costing for research, the Treasury civil servants would always caricature it as just replacing the test tubes. And of course, we have to recognise that policymakers like to go to topping out ceremonies and cutting ribbons and donning hard hats. And we never quite found a way to persuade the Treasury that replacing the test tubes in their characterisation of it was as important as building shiny new buildings. And I think that's a challenge we need to confront. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for bringing in the history, but also very important sort of personal anecdotes from people, which gives you a sense of how this is received. Now, look, every business cross-subsidizes. You know, you go to a pharmaceutical company, they lose money doing research, but that research allows them to create new products, and that's where the circle goes around. But in the long run, I don't think subsidies by themselves are a problem. I think the challenge for us is probably twofold. One is it defensible to the payer? You know, is the level of subsidy, because essentially you're taking subsidy from fees and you're applying it largely for research, is it defensible? And secondly, will the market bear it? You know, for how long will the bearer keep paying the extra cost for what you are in some sense using for the subsidy of the organization? And look, these are the challenges ahead of us. Now, we've got some wonderful questions. And the first one is, do you think TRAC could help institutions plan for transformation? So we all need to transform. We know if the international student levy comes, it's going to wipe out yet another $500 million from what you've seen. It'll increase our deficits in other places. But the point is, can it be used for transformation? And if so, which aspect of it? Jackie, you're probably closest to it from both ways.
There's always a challenge that TRAC data, of course, is retrospective. And when you're trying to think in terms of transformation, you're trying to think prospectively. But on the other hand, I think if it is analyzed and assessed carefully enough, it can give enough indication of how internal costs are distributed to start to give a sense of those areas and which might need attention. And I think Alison's point was a really important one, that the data is very much focused on entirely on academic colleagues, and yet professional services colleagues are not only numerous, they often do contribute to teaching and in certain kind of ways to research activities as well. There is something there that suggests that we are getting a very partial set of data, let alone, you know, the difficulties with how that data is even gathered. And whether that in and of itself needs to be something that we start looking at much more carefully to try to get that full understanding of costing and pricing within universities, I think is probably something we would want to think about carefully.
And just, Jackie, so that everyone else understands, it's not as if the professional services costs are not counted in TRAC. It's just that they're largely allocated as a fraction of, you know, academic time-driven cost, as if the academic time is the biggest driver of all costs in it. But you said TRAC is backward-looking. People want to know what's coming next. Here's a good question from Patrick Jack. He says, as we prepare for the first release of the university financial accounts for 24-25, what do you think we can expect? Will things get better? Will things get worse? Richard, perhaps this would mostly be determined by international student income. Do we have a good sense whether across the UK international student income last year went up or down?
So certainly we know for 24-25 that the rate of decline increased. So we saw a bigger drop in overseas entrants into the UK sector compared to 23-24 than we saw from that year before. We do know that some of the data around visas is not encouraging. We also know that there are issues around the conversion rate. So even where somebody's maybe paid a deposit, met all the conditions of their offer, enrollment comes around and larger numbers of people are just not showing up. In part because there's a tendency to have more insurances sort of outside of the UCAS systems, so talking more about postgraduate taught. I think the other thing is, in terms of the financial statements, there are clearly people who are looking at reducing their cost base, but in the short term, that might actually be reflected in higher costs. So if there is a redundancy program, for instance, it's pain where you recognize all those payments immediately, but the hope is that your long-term sustainability is improved. There are some positive noises coming from OFS about the institutions that they've engaged with and the success that they found in trying to improve their financial sustainability. So I think this might be a case, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
All right, so that's Richard's prediction. Now, when will the 24-25 track come out so that we can actually test this prediction? Jackie, what's the time it's usually released? It's usually spring of the year after?
It's usually around about the June, early July period. So it's collected in the autumn of the year after. So yes, right around about now, people are pulling together their data from the last academic year, submitted by usually around about the end of January, assessed, analyzed, processed, all the rest of it through Office for Students, and then released usually in that early summer period. So by the time it comes through, of course, it's a year and a half later. And while there's other data that we can look at, as Richard was just saying, there's all that kind of internal data that you won't know about unless you scrutinize also the public accounts and try to make the cross references. So there was a question about, is it, since people have to do public accounts anyway, should it be one or the other? Well, of course, annual accounts measure something different. They're there for a different purpose. TRAC, because it can look in quite a lot of detail at an institution's own setup and its own costs. It gives you a different picture. I know that we'll want to get to other questions, but I do just want to reflect that there's a lot of variation in the sector. It's not just pre-92, post-92. It's not just big and small. It's specialist. It's the different ways of collecting the data. It makes it very difficult to find a harmonized way to do this, because as soon as an institution says, well, we all do it this way, you could find many other institutions simply don't. And that's, I think, the variability of the sector is one of our challenges when we look at something like TRAC and how we make those comparisons across the piece, even within peer groups.
Right. Thank you. Alison, I wanted to bring you back in on something important that you raised. If you look at the single biggest source of deficit, activity deficit in the entire TRAC system, it's what is reported as institution-owned funded research. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer, because anyone reading this report and just reading the title might think that the vice chancellor out there giving out money in the university for people to do research. How I wish that could be true. That ain't true. What is true, and what that refers to in some sense, is the implicit scholarship time. Yes. That all academics who are employed are not employed 100% to do teaching and administration. They have a certain amount of time to do research. That has been the convention in our system. For that, traditionally, the university reimbursed them. Then some of them, if their discipline was such, got external grants, and some of them, if their discipline was such, got external grants that also gave back a bit of their time. But the traditional British university model was that there was some time that was a part of your contract that essentially came out in 2011 out of the block grant that the university got to do teaching and research.
Yes.
The problem is that block grant became fees. That fees got eroded by 30 to 40%. And at this moment, there is no room in domestic fees for any academic to do scholarship. There is some room in international student fees, but not in. So, Alison, what does this mean for the very ethos of a system where research and teaching have been inextricably linked, but where domestic fees cannot afford that anymore?
I think it's fundamental to the future of a university. I mean, if we're not going to have what I'm going to call scholarship as well as research, because research is, this is a whole other discussion. But when we come to funded research, published research, as you know, and as I'm sure just about everybody on this seminar knows, this tends to be very, very constrained by a number of factors. It becomes narrower. There's this huge emphasis on originality as opposed to breadth. Nobody pays you for reading widely except as part of your ordinary teaching job, bluntly. I mean, that's of course an exaggeration at the edges, but it's not much of an exaggeration. And I do think this is fundamental. And I think it's something that we have to actually bring much more into the discussion of university finances than we have at the moment. If I'm going to sort of turn it around, and of course this varies from institution to institution, I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with teaching people who are not home students. I mean, quite the opposite. I mean, they are enormously enriching. So if we think of teaching income as a whole, then what you could say the other way around is that in spite of the fact that successive governments have not been willing to pay or to force home students to pay for what we all still think of as what a university should be, we have been able to maintain that model because we've actually been able to increase the overall teaching pot. But I do think that we have not done a good job of making it clear that if you're not prepared to pay for a certain amount of time, which is, and I do think this term scholarship is helpful, particularly given what is happening to funded research, that if there is no room in our lives for scholarship, then we are effectively saying goodbye to the university as we knew it. And that's something which I don't think is made clear enough. Now, there are also other pressures as well in terms of, putting 300 people in a lecture theatre is not the same as having 8 people in a seminar room. But I think this is the one that I feel most strongly about, that if we don't do this, then we are effectively saying that we are a very expensive school.
Okay, all right. So then we're a teaching university. And look, around the world, there are institutions.
Teaching university should also have time for scholarship. I mean, I
Right.
don't think that people in schools don't also, that teachers don't also do a huge amount of reading around the job. But what is happening in schools is that they are teaching a fixed curriculum. And what people come to universities for is to be in touch with something which is changing under their feet.
Dynamic, particularly at this time. Well, there's an interesting question by Quentin Jackson, and that's about cost recovery. And let me put it to the panel in this way. Okay, the government has fixed costs and it has FEC formula. But anytime we do private research, for research outside of the public or the charity, universities are free to charge. But TRAC shows that universities are even losing money when they're doing research for the private sector. Now, that would be very hard to defend. What is your thoughts on that? I mean, that's like taking fees money and giving it to a large private corporation through your research. First, is the data to be believed? Jackie, you do point out, people fill it out in many ways and it's all driven by time allocation. But why do universities lose money when they're essentially doing research as a contract charge to a private company? Richard, Jackie?
There's been...
Yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's been some very interesting research done, funded through UKRI, and I think it applies probably to all funding of research, and we're just not very good at sometimes predicting what these costs are going to be. So actually, we do try and cost these things out properly, but there are delays that are often completely beyond the PI's control. Kind of there are hidden costs that hadn't been foreseen. I think we are underestimating the amount of time some of these things take, sort of routinely. You know, some of it is the challenge between charge out rates, which are based on historical data being applied to future projects, and you know, trying to gauge what inflation is going to be, and that's not an easy thing for people to do. I think also, and it's difficult to know how much this has an impact. I think there's still a bit of a perception that if you ask for less, your chances of being successful in your bid are greater. So I think our tendency is to slightly sort of underplay the costs, whether consciously or subconsciously, as part of that process.
And if I could add to that, yeah, I mean, especially in, I think, some of that more sort of privately funded research where you might be going into tender, you know, you are trying to put in a tender that will win the bid. And sometimes that does mean undercosting something, because then it makes your tender look more attractive. But all it really does is then, as you say, throw the cost back on the university, because the cost doesn't go away. It just hasn't been costed. So it makes it even harder, I think, for the university as a whole, once you look across the entire research spectrum, for it to get the return that it needs on the various costs that are required to undertake any form of research. But I think we have to balance that with the other side of some of the criticisms come through, that universities are, in, say, indirect costs, overcharging in order to try to recover and make, be able to cover their costs that they lose on other forms. So there's that very, very difficult balancing act that institutions are trying to make to, in the end, somehow come close to breaking even on some of these activities, even though we know from all the data that in terms of research, you will never break even, will you? You will always lose money on undertaking research, no matter the size, shape, or composition of that research.
Okay, Jackie, while I have you, can I draw your attention to another element of TRAC? You know, in its major table, it has something called other income generating activities. And it shows that the universities lose 2% of money in other income generating activities. Now, you know, the average person will understand, okay, research, it's a noble cause, it's your mission. Why do universities lose money in income generating activities? I mean, it's rather oxymoronic.
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm probably not going to be able to give you a very good answer to it, because again, there are so many different things that can populate that category of other. You might be an institution, for instance, that has a lot of halls of residence, and you are bringing in money in that kind of way, but not necessarily enough money to cover the costs of those halls of residence. You might be an institution that doesn't have any of that kind of income, but you're spending your money in other kinds of ways. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the classic, is the money coming in enough to cover the costs of what is going out? So it's generating income, yes, but it's not generating sufficient income to cover the expenditure.
It's not generating surplus. Yeah, no, residence is a good example, because I know of a lot of universities that actually actively subsidize their residents to make it more accessible, to bring in a widening set of students. It's a noble activity, but put all together, you know, the system is creaking. So I'm mindful of time. I'm sorry that we cannot get to the questions, but I'm going to do a quick fire round and ask people, over the next 2 or 3 years, the TRAC is likely to keep getting worse. Will it be used to change the system, or will its insights be used to change the system? Alison, Richard, Nick, and then Jackie, in that order. Alison, 3 years from now?
I think it will be used by government to force change on us. I'm not sure it will be used correctly or in a granular way.
All right, Richard?
I hope so. I would hope universities sort of engage with it. you know, accepting everything that we've said about the challenges and the limitations, but this is ultimately a zero-sum game. You know, something's recovering more of its cost and something's recovering less. So to the anecdote that Nick had earlier, kind of where, you know, if it's misrepresenting both teaching and research, kind of then where's all the money going? So I do think there is a lot of value in telling people where to look as part of their transformation and the difficult prioritization.
Nick, you published that booklet 2017. We're still here. TRAC's gotten worse. Next 3 years.
Yeah, and Richard said earlier it's going to get worse before it gets better. My fear is it's going to get worse before it gets even worse. And I think politicians will look at the TRAC, and it's referred to in the white paper. But of course, when and if a university hits the wall financially, they are not going to be looking at TRAC data that's 18 months out of date by the time it's published. They, you know, it will be a sense of urgency and a sense of crisis. So I think the best we can hope for is it will inform public policy to an even greater degree in the future than in the past, particularly given the improvements Jackie talks about, but that it's not the be-all and end-all. And of course, there's lots of other data like universities' own accounts as well to be read alongside.
Jackie, you've devoted a lot of your time and energy to this. The final word is with you.
Well, I hope that it is used in a way that will help the sector. I think classically the government doesn't know how to cost our activity, and we aren't always very good at it either. And you know, when it comes to something like TRAC, which is meant to reflect the cost of what we do, the wobbliness of some of that data doesn't help us either. I think it will be around and being used. I think I'm with both Nick and Alison in that I worry about how.
Well, I hope it is done in a matter that's benign and helpful, but that can only remain a hope. And all I have to do now is to thank you all, to thank many colleagues at King's Policy Institute, particularly Eliel Cohen, who's been behind this project, and of course, Bobby Duffy, those who helped us organize this evening, all our panelists and the over 200 guests who joined us. Thank you very much. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in TRAC. Let's hope it turns out to be benign and helpful in the long run. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your days.